This attack is of decisive importance. It must succeed, and it must do so rapidly and convincingly. The victory at Kursk must be a blazing torch to the world. Adolf Hitler was fully aware of the absolute necessity of success at Kursk. But when the roaring waves of German armor crashed into the salient in July 1943, the attack which the German army was about to unleash was already doomed to failure. The essence of von Manstein's strategy for the battle had been to exploit the mobility and tactical superiority of the German panzer units. Instead, the German tanks drove confidently towards a grinding war of attrition, where the advantage lay squarely with the defenders.
When the first enemy tanks appeared, we all started counting them. I personally tried several times but lost count. I remember the last time I got to something like 30, but more and more came lumbering out of the wood. Only when the distance between us and the tanks was 400 to 500 meters did we open fire. One after another, the tanks went down. The enemy apparently never dreamed that one gun dared to engage 36 tanks and an infantry landing. No doubt they thought they had run into considerable forces.
This excerpt from the diary of Gunnery Sergeant Nikolai Kanistchev confirms the effectiveness of a Russian defense which limited the progress of von Kluge's 9th Army to an advance of some 6 miles. It was then ground to a halt by Rokossovsky's central front to the north of the Kursk salient. In the south, von Manstein's 4th Panzer Army advanced 25 miles by the 10th of July and threatened to penetrate the Voronezh front under Marshal Vatutin. Reserves from the Steppes front to the north had to be pumped into the battle to bolster the salient's defenders and prevent the 4th Panzers from breaking through into open country. By now, the incredible waves of armored might thrown at each other by both sides had fully engaged, and the contest began to degenerate into a series of localized slugging matches. On the black scorched earth, the gutted tanks burned like torches. It was difficult to establish which side was attacking and which defending. But in the face of the reinforcements from the north, von Manstein's forces gathered themselves for a final titanic effort. The result was the biggest tank battle in military history. 1,500 tanks met in a head-on confrontation, which showed armored warfare at its crudest and most brutal. While both sides suffered heavy casualties, the second arm of the German pincer movement was finally paralyzed. The Germans had fallen into Zhukov's cunningly prepared trap. As Guderian acknowledged,
by the failure of Citadel, we had suffered a decisive defeat. The armored formations, reformed and re-equipped with much effort, had lost heavily both in manpower and equipment, and would now be unemployable for a long time to come. It was problematical whether they could be rehabilitated in time to defend the Eastern Front. From now on, the enemy was in undisputed possession of the initiative.
Having enticed the Germans into the total but disastrous commitment of their armored forces, the Red Army swiftly exploited their advantage. Even while the gargantuan tank struggle was still being bitterly contested, on the 12th of July, the Russians counterattacked towards Orel, which was itself a salient in German hands. Army Group Center, reinforced by units from the 4th Panzer Army, which had broken off its attack on Kursk, attempted to check the advance. But by now, the Eastern Front was not the only theater of disaster for the German armies. On the 10th of July, Allied forces had invaded Sicily. By the 25th, Mussolini had been arrested and a provisional government set up in Italy. Fearing the defection of his Mediterranean ally, Hitler desperately needed to make troops available for the defense of the peninsula. On August the 1st, he ordered an immediate withdrawal from the Orel salient. By the 5th of August, the provincial capitals of Orel and Belgorod had been liberated. Near Belgorod, the Germans attempted a counterattack with 60,000 troops and 18,000 Hitler Youth, who arrived at the front carrying flags with the ironic inscription, "The world belongs to us." The ensuing battle, rapidly described by Guy Sire of the Grossdeutschland Division, tempered their youthful arrogance.
It is difficult to remember moments when there is nothing under a steel helmet but an astonishingly empty head and a pair of eyes which translate nothing more than the eyes of an animal facing mortal danger. There is nothing but the rhythm of explosions and the cries of madmen, to be classified later as the cries of heroes or murderers. And there are the cries of the wounded, of the agonizing dying shrieking as they stare at a part of their body reduced to pulp. The cries of men touched by the shock of battle, who run in any and every direction, howling like banshees. There are the tragic, unbelievable visions which carry from one moment of nausea to the next, guts splattered across the rubble and sprayed from one dying man to another. Tightly riveted machines ripped like the belly of a cow which has just been sliced open. Trees broken into tiny fragments, gaping windows pouring out torrents of billowing dust, dispersing into oblivion all that remains of a comfortable parlor.
The frenzied German counterstroke succeeded in pushing back the Red Army, but the Russian tide of resurgence was irresistible. After clawing their way forward for 10 days, the German advance was again flung back towards the Dnieper, and the Great Retreat was about to begin. The all-conquering German army, which had disdainfully swept aside the Russian border defenses only 2 years previously, was now struggling to maintain a presence on the field of battle. The panzer units, which had sliced the Red Army to pieces in a series of dazzling pincer movements, now flung themselves headlong at the Russians in the desperate hope of slowing their progress. For the ordinary German soldiers, the notion of victory ceased to have meaning. The survival of themselves and their immediate comrades became the central concern of their lives. On the Russian side, the liberation of the cities and towns in their path was proving a bittersweet experience. In Orel, the Soviet troops arrived to find half the town destroyed and all its bridges demolished by the retreating Germans. Of the pre-war population of 114,000, only 30,000 haggard souls survived to greet their saviors. 25,000 had been sent as slaves to the labor camps of the Reich. 12,000 had been murdered by their German overlords, and thousands had died from disease and starvation. The mood of the retreating Germans was one of intense frustration and manic desperation.
Even the most hermetically sealed of our men understood that no matter how many hundreds of Russians he killed or how bravely he fought, the next day hundreds more would appear, and so on for the next day and the day after that. And even the blindest saw that the Russian soldiers were moved by a blind heroism and boldness, so that even a mountain of dead compatriots wouldn't stop them. We didn't wish to die, and would kill and massacre as if to avenge ourselves in advance for what was about to happen. When we died, it was with fury, because we hadn't been able to exact enough retribution.
This fury would now be unleashed towards civilians and soldiers indiscriminately. The Germans had been decisively defeated, but the war in the east was far from over. The only hope for the armies of the Reich in the midst of this desperate retreat now lay in holding the line of the river Dnieper.
Sometimes we would try to run away, but orders, adroitly worded and spaced, soothed us like shots of morphine. On the Dnieper, we were told everything will be easier. Ivan won't be able to force the barrage. So courage and do your best to hold him if you want everyone to get through. The Russian counter-offensive will be crushed on the Dnieper, and then we will resume our push to the east.
Even though a strategic withdrawal to the Dnieper seemed the only possible option for the ragged German formations, Hitler initially stuck to his intransigent policy of holding territory to the last man. Von Tippelskirch, one of the German generals in the east, summed up the helpless rage of the field commanders forced to sacrifice men and material to a principle of no withdrawal, which had now been elevated to a moral necessity.
The series of withdrawals, by adequately large steps, would have worn down the Russian strength, besides creating opportunities for counterstrokes when the German forces were numerous enough to make them effective. The root cause of German defeat was the way that her forces were wasted in fruitless efforts, and above all, fruitless resistance at the wrong time and place.
By the 23rd of August, Kharkov was once again in Russian hands. By the 30th, Taganrog had fallen. The capture of Donbass was followed by Novorossiysk, and by the 25th of September, Smolensk had also been retaken. In the face of such irresistible momentum, even Hitler had to concede that the waters of the Dnieper represented the only possibility of regrouping the decimated German divisions. For the pursuing Red Army, the liberation of the towns and villages east of the Dnieper continued to fill the hearts of its soldiers with a succession of contrasting emotions. Boris Shugiev was part of the force that liberated Belorussia. A farm woman came running to our forward line, tears streaming down her face. She said, "Sons, come and see what those monsters have done." In the village by the house that had served the Nazis as a field hospital, she showed us a pit which had been covered with soil. That soil still breathed and moved. We shoveled it away, and the sight of what was underneath filled us with horror. The pit was full of the bodies of little boys and girls aged between 10 and 12 years. The Nazi butchers had used them to give blood transfusions to their wounded officers, and had then dumped them into the pit. I sincerely hope that no one ever feels what we did at that moment. For the others, such as Vladimir Varbarov, the horror of the atrocities was diluted by the welcome of the survivors. On the far end of the village, the enemy is still massing for a counterattack to drive us out. Then, from the cellars and basements of half-ruined houses, out of dugouts, running, climbing and clambering, came our long-suffering countrymen. Dressed in indescribable rags, women whose age it is impossible to tell, children and old people all rush to embrace us, clinging and sobbing. "Our men have come," they cry. But we, electrified by such a reception and flushed by the ongoing battle, keep peering apprehensively over our shoulders, alert for a gun battle around the corner, for a German counterattack. Extricating ourselves gently from clasping arms, we reached the far end of what was now our village once again, clearing it of the Germans as we go. The exhilaration of the liberators is comparable to none other. This is a joy that would last you for the rest of your life, till your dying day. By the second half of September, the Russians had pressed the retreating Germans back to the banks of the Dnieper. The myth of Aryan superiority was wearing thin for the pursuing Red Army. A poem by Mikhail Lukonin encapsulated the mood of the advancing forces with its heavy irony.
Just look at the wall where the shells pass through. Can you see where the writing is clear? We are supermen, and to prove it, the fascists march row upon row as they mutter together with their hands in the air. Our tank rolls on to new tasks in haste. We nudge each other's ribs as we read, in Gothic, on a smoke-blackened fragment of wall, the slogan, "We're an invincible breed."
However, even in retreat, the elite units of the German army, such as the Grossdeutschland Division, managed to maintain something of their reputations by mounting a ferocious defense of the German rear.
We withdrew to the Dnieper and safety, slowing down the enemy as much as we could. Our desperate efforts continued for days at a time, across hundreds of miles. When men who had escaped from rearguard units finally reached the river, they were confronted by a vast human swarm. Entire armies were waiting beside the few bridges our engineers had managed to restore, tramping up and down, climbing onto anything that would float.
But the Dnieper was not to prove the refuge the battered German troops had been promised. Even as their defensive perimeter finally withdrew to the river's edge, they found the Russians already established there. Goaded onwards by their commanders, by the atrocities they had witnessed, and the prospect of sweeping the enemy from the motherland, the Russians dispatched the German rear guard and immediately prepared to continue their pursuit. Between the 22nd and the 30th of September, the Russians had forced numerous crossings of the 300-mile stretch of river between the Pripyat marshes and Zaporozhye. Further south, by the 23rd of October, Zaporozhye and Melitop were taken by the Russians, and the 17th German Army was isolated in the Crimea, reducing the dwindling strength of their eastern forces by a further 250,000. To the north, Kiev fell on the 6th of November, threatening the northern flank of Army Group South's defense of the Dnieper Bend. This Soviet pressure continued throughout November and December. Despite von Manstein's pleas to abandon what was now a vulnerable salient, Hitler remained adamant that the Dnieper Bend was to be held at all costs. By the new year of 1944, the line of German resistance from the Baltic to the Black Sea had either collapsed or was suffering such Russian pressure as to make it untenable. In Italy, the Allies had landed on September the 3rd and were battling their way up the peninsula. Back in Germany, the Reich was experiencing destruction from the air on a scale never before experienced by any nation at war. In the first major blow against Hamburg, 30,000 people perished in a series of raids, which left many more scarred and burned. Hamburg was swept by a holocaust which created such intense firestorms that tornadoes were formed which sucked living people into the flames. Huge bomber formations were circling over Hamburg. The entire sky was lit with hundreds of flares. Amidst the roaring and rumbling, the whizzing and whistling of the falling bombs passing through the air seemed never to end. Throughout the latter half of 1944, the bombing raids increased in intensity until on the 22nd of November, the heaviest air raid of the war was launched against Berlin. Almost 2.5 tons of bombs were dropped in 30 minutes. The noose around Germany was tightening rapidly, and the new year on the Eastern Front offered no relief from the process of strangulation. By January the 2nd, the Russians had advanced north of Kiev and were now just 18 miles from the 1939 Polish border. On the 14th, the offensive which came to be known as the Liberation of Leningrad was launched. Soviet forces smashed through the German defensive positions around the city, clearing the territory as far as Novgorod. On the 17th of January, the besieged city was finally liberated. Leningrad had endured 900 days of isolation and unbelievable hardship. Over 1 million people had died. These pages from the diary of Tanya Savisheva, a young girl who lived in the city during the siege, poignantly catalogued the destruction of the entire family.
Shenya died 28th December at 12 o'clock, 1941. Granny died 25th January, 3 in the afternoon, 1942. Leka died 17th March at 5 in the morning, 1942. Uncle Vazia died 13th April, 2 at night, 1942. Uncle Lyosha, 10th May, at 4 in the afternoon, 1942. Mummy, 13th May at 7:30 in the morning, 1942. The Savachevas are dead, all dead, all dead.
On the 4th of March, the northern flank of von Manstein's Army Group South was pierced by the 1st Ukrainian Front under the direct command of Marshal Zhukov. By the 7th, after advancing 100 miles, the Russians were astride the Warsaw-Odessa railway line, and by the 28th, Nikdayev on the Bug had been captured.
Further south, the river Dniester was crossed, and Kherson at the mouth of the Dnieper overrun.
By April, the Red Army's overstretched supply lines and the spring floods dictated an end to what was now being named the Mud Offensive.
In the Crimea, however, the Russians continued to attack, and Sevastopol was retaken on the 19th of May, bringing the north shore of the Black Sea into Soviet hands once more.
While the Russians were threatening the southern sector of the Eastern Front with collapse, events were unfolding off the south coast of England, which would completely alter the complexion of the war in the East. The long-awaited Second Front was about to be created. A fleet of over 5,000 vessels had been gathered together for the invasion of France. 1,200 naval vessels were on hand to sweep for mines, bombard the German coastal defenses, and protect the invaders from airborne and naval assault. 4,000 ships, barges, tugs, and amphibious craft were available for the transportation of the 2 million men and their weapons, which were to be landed on the northern coast of France over a 2-month period. Two Mulberry harbours as large as medium-sized ports were to be towed across the channel in sections and constructed close to the French shore. In the air, 7,500 aircraft were mustered for the direct support of the invasion.
In the early hours of the morning of the 6th of June, the first Allied paratroopers were dropped behind the targeted beaches.
At dawn, 5 landing parties approached these beaches from the sea. Despite setbacks such as the gale on the 19th of June, which wrecked one Mulberry harbour and severely damaged the second, by the first week in July, 1 million Allied soldiers had been landed. While the attention of the world focused on the D-Day landing and its aftermath, the Red Army launched a fresh offensive against Army Group Center in Belarusia. Most of the 3rd Panzer Army was destroyed within a few days. At the beginning of July, a further 100,000 German troops were encircled at Minsk. In another week, Army Group Center had been completely destroyed. An incision 250 miles wide had been sliced in the German front, and casualties were estimated at 300,000. The Russian army now had a clear pathway to East Prussia and the Baltic. The failure of the Germans to deal with the summer offensive was emerging as a disaster on such a scale that even the debacle of Stalingrad paled in comparison. The war correspondent Alexander Worth reported from the Russian capital. In Moscow today, all hearts are filled with joy. Every night, a familiar, deep male voice, speaking like a man giving orders to soldiers, announces a new major victory. Division after division has been encircled and wiped out. Hundreds of thousands killed and about 100,000 taken prisoner. The score of generals captured is about 25. Of these 100,000 or so prisoners, 57,000 were paraded through the streets of Moscow with their generals at their head. The Moscow crowd was remarkably disciplined. They watched the Germans walk, or rather shuffle past, in their dirty grey-green uniforms. This grey-green mould which had rotted away half of European Russia and was still rotting a great part of Europe. The Moscow people looked on quietly without booing or hissing, and only a few youngsters could be heard shouting, "Hey, look at the Fritzes with their ugly snouts." But most people only exchanged remarks in soft voices. I heard a little girl perched on her mother's shoulders say, "Mummy, are these the people who killed Daddy?" And the mother hugged the child and wept. The Germans had finally arrived in Moscow. When the parade was over, Russian sanitation trucks disinfected the streets. By the middle of July, the Germans had been swept from Belarusia, and the Russians held much of northeast Poland. As they drove northwards into Lithuania, Army Group North was threatened with encirclement. South of the Pripyat Marsh, Army Group North Ukraine were flung back beyond Lvov and Lublin. By the end of the month, units of the Red Army had reached the Vistula and were attacking the Warsaw suburbs. On the 1st of August, the Polish Home Army Command in London, anxious that the Polish capital should not fall into the hands of the advancing Soviets, ordered the Warsaw partisans to rise against their Nazi oppressors. It was to prove a tragic mistake. The 20,000 insurgents held only enough ammunition for 7 days' fighting. By the end of the battle, after 2 months of bitter struggle, 9/10 of the city had been destroyed. 200,000 people had been massacred, and the rest deported to extermination camps. The SS had organized an orgy of savagery, dousing people with petrol and setting them alight, gassing them in sewers, and subjecting them to a nightmare regime of torture and out-of-hand execution. During this period, the Red Army remained on the outskirts of the city. Stalin was accused of standing by while this barbarous campaign of reprisal wiped out any opposition to Russian domination of Poland. On the 20th of August, the Soviet army unexpectedly launched a major offensive against Romania, which was almost completely devoid of air and panzer reserves. By the 23rd, 20 German divisions had been encircled in a giant pocket between the rivers Dnestr and Prut. According to the military historian Ziemka,
In executing their breakthroughs, the Russians showed an elegance in their tactical conceptions, economy of force and control that did not fall short of the Germans' own performance in the early war years.
The effect of these reverses on Hitler was catastrophic. Increasingly, he retreated into a semi-fantasy world which only partly corresponded to the realities of the battlefield. In the words of Alan Bullock, one of his most astute biographers,
until he could force events to conform to the pattern he sought to impose and reappear as the magician vindicated, he hid himself away in his headquarters. Hitler's ostensible reason for shutting himself away was the demands made on him by the war. But there was a deeper psychological compulsion at work. Here he lived in a private world of his own, from which the ugly and awkward facts of Germany's situation were excluded. He refused to visit the bombed towns, just as he refused to read reports which contradicted the picture he wanted to form.
The commanders in the East nevertheless had to deal with the orders of this shambling reclusive, who was now a pathetic shadow of the decisive, intuitive, and supremely arrogant leader who had launched Operation Barbarossa only 3 years previously. A leader who even in 1943 could declare, "I am no ordinary soldier king, but a warlord, probably the most successful in history." By now, Hitler had survived numerous assassination attempts, most of them originating in the upper echelons of the army command structure. The most effective came in July 1944, when Colonel Count Klaus von Stauffenberg carried a bomb in a briefcase into Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia and left it beneath a conference table. Back in Berlin, other officers waited for Stauffenberg to return before taking over the capital. But Hitler emerged from the blast relatively unscathed, and soon the plotters were paying the price for their failure. Stauffenberg was shot by a firing squad in the courtyard of the War Ministry. Ludwig Beck, former Chief of Staff, committed suicide. On the day following the attempt, a lightning series of arrests and executions took place. Some of the conspirators were beheaded, others hanged from meat hooks to die by strangulation. More were shipped off to the death camps to be gassed, hanged, or shot. According to General Guderian,
Hitler's mistrust now reached extremes, and the miracle of his survival gave him greater faith than ever in his mission. He lost himself more and more in a realm of the imagination which had no basis in reality. Every free expression of opinion and every objection to his frequently incomprehensible views evoked an outburst of rage on his part.
the result, according to General von Westphal, was that
the gulf between the Führer and the German army leaders was now unbridgeable. It arose from irreconcilable conflict between concrete and abstract thinking, between sober objectivity and the chasing of fantasies, between logical calculation based on facts and the attempt to force the facts to fit impossible desires. It was an intense spiritual torment for every thinking German soldier to be unable to ward off the impending military and moral disaster, to have to look on while everything was wasted and squandered.
By the middle of 1944, the entire senior leadership on the Eastern Front had been replaced. Von Kuschler, von Manstein, von Kleist, and Busch had all been removed. In some cases, their successors were themselves almost immediately dismissed for their failure to live up to Hitler's expectations. While Hitler struggled to impose his illusions on an increasingly reluctant reality, Stalin's grasp of realpolitik had never been stronger. Confident now of victory, he paused on the Vistula, and encouraged the formation of a provisional communist Polish government in Lublin. Seeking to maximize the Russian sphere of influence far beyond its pre-war boundaries, he sent the Red Army of Liberation northwards into the Baltic and southwest into the Balkans. By the 31st of August, Bucharest had been entered. An essentially communist government was formed, and Romania was compelled to ratify its 1940 loss of territory to Russia. It was also forced to pay the Soviet Union a financial indemnity and use its army to fight against its erstwhile allies. The Red Army had advanced 250 miles in 12 days. In the next 6 days, it dashed a further 200 miles to the Yugoslav border at Târnu-Severin. From here, the Soviets launched a giant flanking maneuver against the Axis defenders of Hungary. By the 24th of September, the southeast salient of Hungary had been removed, and the Russians advanced to within 100 miles of Budapest. Further south, the Yugoslav capital Belgrade was liberated with the aid of the Yugoslavian resistance under Tito. Bulgaria, until now at war only with Britain and the United States, was pressurized by Germany into declaring war on the USSR as well. 4 days after this declaration of the 5th of September, the Bulgarians surrendered. Further west, Slovakia, formerly a co-belligerent of Germany, had been in a state of upheaval since the previous year. A general uprising began in the second half of 1944, but a Russian advance which began in September was held up in the Carpathians by stiff German resistance and failed to reach Slovakia before the middle of October. By then, the 65,000-strong uprising had been quelled. The by now sickeningly familiar results of Nazi barbarity greeted Russian liberators, and more than 200 mass graves had been filled with slaughtered Slovaks. In the north, an armistice was concluded with Finland, and the Germans were driven back into Norway before climatic conditions put an end to the fighting there. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were overrun, and the German Army Group North isolated in the Kurland Peninsula. By January 1945, with all German troops finally driven from the holy soil of Mother Russia, and Stalin in control of the Balkans and the Baltic states, the Red Army prepared for its final drive towards the Reich. Between June and November, the German army in the east had suffered over 1 million casualties, 214,000 killed and 626,000 missing in action. (1944) had proved Germany's most disastrous year of the war in the east. 106 divisions had been destroyed, 3 more than the total number mobilized in September 1939. German intelligence estimated that in the assault on the Reich, the Red Army would possess a superiority of 11-to-1 in infantry, 7-to-1 in tanks, and 20-to-1 in guns. Hitler dismissed such estimates as bluff. On the 12th of January, the Soviets launched their expected offensive from the Vistula against the German Central Front. The 70 divisions of Army Group Centre and Army Group A were pierced over an area of 200 miles, and almost 200 divisions of the Red Army poured through the breach. By the end of the month, Soviet forces reached the lower reaches of the River Oder and were now only 40 miles from Berlin. The remnants of Army Group Center had been encircled in East Prussia. Falling back on the ancient city of Königsberg, they pathetically attempted to carry out Hitler's orders to defend the region to the last man. The Soviet tide was finally halted on the line of the rivers Oder and Neisse in February. But the limited German counterstroke was merely postponing the inevitable. A fresh Russian offensive in Hungary progressed to the borders of Austria by April the 1st, and 6 days later, the outskirts of Vienna were coming under Soviet fire. To the north, on April the 16th, the final thrust towards Berlin was begun. On the first day of the assault alone, 42,000 artillery pieces and mortars fired 2,450 freight car loads of shells toward the German lines. Zhukov, excited at the prospect of being the first Soviet commander to reach Berlin, described the opening of the attack. Thousands of multicolored rockets flew into the air. At the signal, 140 searchlights, stationed at every 200 meters, were turned on. The field of battle was flooded by light, blinding the enemy and spotlighting the targets for our attacking tanks and infantry. It was an impressive sight. I don't remember anything in my life to rival the sensation. Having retreated to the capital, Hitler alternated between vitriolic outbursts about betrayal and demonic delight in the Holocaust which was descending on Germany. In the words of Admiral Speer, he deliberately attempted to make everything perish with him. He had reached a state in which, as far as he was concerned, the end of his own life meant the end of the world. Goebbels shared his manic sentiments. Under the ruins of our demolished cities, the accomplishments of the stupid 19th century lie buried. Our end will be the end of the whole universe. According to the historian Trevor Roper,
Hitler and Goebbels called upon the German people to destroy their towns and factories, blow up their bridges and dams and the railway and all the rolling stock for the sake of a legend, the twilight of the gods. In his last days, Hitler seemed like a cannibal god, rejoicing in the ruin of his own temples. Almost his last orders were for execution, prisoners to be slaughtered. His old surgeon was to be murdered. His own brother was to be executed. All traitors without further specification were to die. Like an ancient hero, Hitler wished to be sent with human sacrifices to the grave.
Army, state, and economic leaders tried to mediate Hitler's destructiveness with varying degrees of success. By the 22nd of April, with Russian troops now fighting on the streets of the German capital, the insanity was about to end. But the street warfare in Berlin was bitter. The threat of a Bolshevik invasion had been hyped by the Nazi propaganda machine as the end of Germany and the German people. Even in the last chaotic days of the Reich, there was a common joke. Enjoy the war while you can. The peace will be terrible. Lothar Löwe, at 16 years of age, was defending the city in an anti-tank unit armed with bazookas.
We began to believe what Goebbels had said so often. If the Russians invaded, they would kill everyone. And whoever wasn't killed would be sent to the mines in Siberia. And whoever was sent there would never come back. Every civilized, organized form of life would come to an end. It was a bad war. The nights when the women in the occupied side streets were raped by the Russian soldiers were awful. The screams were horrible. There were terrible scenes. But these, on the other hand, only encouraged us all the more. We were genuinely afraid the Russians would slaughter us. They didn't take prisoners.
On the night of the 28th of April, with the Russian forces grinding ever closer to his headquarters, Hitler married his mistress, Eva Braun. After the wedding meal, he retired to write his last will and testament. He defiantly reaffirmed his belief in Lebensraum and indulged in one final caustic attack on the Jewish race. On the afternoon of the 30th of April, having made his farewells, he poisoned his wife and his dog and shot himself. The Hitler's bodies were burned on a petrol-soaked pyre to be joined the following night by Dr. and Frau Goebbels and the 6 children they had poisoned. On the same evening that Hitler committed suicide, Sergeants Yagarov and Kantaria planted the victory banner of the Soviet flag on the Reichstag at 22:50 hours. It symbolized the triumph of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany. It was hard to believe that less than 4 years previously, an SS private had written to his wife in Munich,
"We are now a distance of 30 kilometers from Moscow and can see some of its spires. Soon we will have surrounded it, and then we will be billeted in sumptuous winter quarters, and I will send you presents that will make Aunt Minna green with envy."
The German invasion, depicted so vividly in Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony as naked evil in all its stupendous, arrogant inhumanity, a terrifying power overrunning Russia, had been turned back upon itself and finally crushed. But the cost had been horrendous. By the 8th of May, when the German Act of Surrender was ratified at Russian headquarters in Berlin, 28 million Russians, 1 in 7 of the population, had died as a direct result of the war. They had died as soldiers, partisans, prisoners of war, slaves, or innocent civilians. They had met their end through bombs, bullets, hunger, torture, burning, and exposure. Less than 5% of the young people aged from 17 to 21 had survived. For each of the 1,418 days of the war, almost 19,000 Russian people had perished. The German invaders destroyed or burnt 1,700 towns and more than 70,000 villages and hamlets, decommissioned 60% of the steelworks and 60% of the coal mines, destroyed 65,000 kilometers of railway lines and 4,100 stations, 36,000 communication centers, and tens of thousands of state farms. They looted and demolished 40,000 medical establishments, 84,000 schools, and 43,000 public libraries. 25 million people had been left homeless. But in the end, the Germans had been defeated. Throughout Europe, Germans from the SS, the army, and the civil administration were put on trial for offenses committed during the Nazi occupation. However, the numbers punished and the severity of their sentences was astonishingly limited given the massive scale of the crimes against humanity which had occurred. Even though the Russian government had the right to hold its own trials under Article 10 of the Four-Power Ordinance, none took place. Stalin was far more concerned about taking vengeance on traitors to the Soviet Union. Some 250,000 prisoners of war, now in Allied hands, were Soviet citizens who had been captured in German uniform. Under agreements affirmed at the Yalta Conference in 1945, those accused of treason or desertion were to be returned to their native countries for judgment. Those who had fought for the Germans were now forcibly repatriated. Some took the only escape route open to them and committed suicide. The Soviet authorities regarded them as human scum and treated them with a barbarity which reflected their hatred. Another 2.25 million Russian prisoners of war had been captured during the occupation or had surrendered on the field of battle. Tragically, Russian administrators seemed to view their very survival as an act of treachery. Many who had lived through years of gruesome warfare and the savage, inhuman degradation of the German work camps were now to meet their end in the penal colonies of their own motherland. Inside Russia, the pre-war status quo was rapidly re-established and strengthened. The cult of Stalin as a personalization of victory ensured that his position as dictator of an authoritarian, centralized society was unassailable. The reforms and liberalizations which had occurred during the organized chaos of the war years were gradually retracted. Religious toleration, a greater modicum of democratic involvement in civilian administration, and the virtues of individual and collective initiative became incompatible with the need of the entrenched elite to control all aspects of societal development. Besides, a new enemy was now emergent. The Cold War with the United States meant that for the best part of the next 10 years, Russia remained on a partial war footing. The major resources of the economy were poured into the military-industrial sector, and the reward of the Russian people for their absolute wartime sacrifices was the call for further selfless devotion to the state. The rebuilding of the ravaged nation would have to wait. But none of this should detract from the awesome achievement of the Soviet people. Through their bravery, their labor, and their sacrifice, they managed to halt and eventually crush a seemingly invincible war machine which, with chilling efficiency, had conquered almost the entire Western European continent in a matter of months. They annihilated a German army which had unleashed in its wake a regime of apocalyptic terror, a tyranny which had turned vast tracts of Europe into a surreal playground of sadists and perverts. The victory of the Soviet people may not have ensured an era of justice and democratic ideals, but it rid the world of the cancerous malignancy of National Socialism, which had for long periods threatened to engulf it.